Welcome to a brand new episode of Goodcents by Union Assurance, where we discuss all things related to finances with the objective of improving financial literacy among Sri Lankans. In today's discussion, we discuss how to make sustainable investments in business opportunities. Joining with us today is Kamal Dorabawila, Chief Investment Officer at IFC. Welcome to the show, Kamal.
Thank you, Sachini.
So Kamal, before we actually talk about the topic for today, can you tell me a little bit about what IFC and World Bank does in terms of investments and private businesses?
Sure. I think that will be very helpful. So a lot of people know of the World Bank as supporting governments and providing financing to governments. But the IFC part of the World Bank focuses on supporting the private sector and delivering our development mandate of alleviating poverty through providing particularly financial support to the private sector and companies in the private sector. So just maybe to illustrate, I'll give you some examples of things I've done over my career. When I first joined IFC, some of the first projects I did were financing two 500 megawatts power plants, thermal power plants in Egypt that were sponsored by one of the world's largest utilities, Electricité de France. Then we replicated that in Mexico as well. So those are some of the projects that we did in thermal power plants. Then in more difficult terrain, I was involved in financing the first large hydropower project in Uganda, where we financed a 250 megawatt hydropower project in Uganda that more than tripled the power generation capacity in Uganda. At that time, the electrification in Uganda was, I think, less than 5%. So these projects have tremendous impact in these countries and really changed the landscape. After I moved to South Asia, to Colombo, to lead IFC's investments in the infrastructure space in South Asia outside of India, and this was about a little over 10 years ago, been doing a number of similar projects in the region. One example is we designed and financed the first LNG import terminal in Bangladesh, and that helped increase Bangladesh's energy generation by over 25 to 30%. And similarly, another project that I led was the largest foreign direct investment in Nepal, a 216 megawatt hydropower project that is costing about $450 million, which we not only provided and arranged the financing, but also put together the contractual structure to do the first of its kind project in Nepal. So there are a number of examples like that we have engaged. But in addition to financing, we are also advising and guiding these companies as well as the governments on how to realize some of these projects that are truly impactful in these countries, but to deliver that through private sector, through commercial means. And finally, in terms of my role, recently I've taken the role to lead IFC's activities in the transport and logistics space across the Asia Pacific, not only South Asia but East Asia and the Pacific as well.
So Kamal, how has Sri Lanka fared in infrastructure investments, and what's IFC's role in it?
So actually in the infrastructure investment space and in infrastructure actually in general, Sri Lanka has predominantly traditionally been delivering infrastructure through public means, through the government funded arrangements. Even today, there is large majority of infrastructure delivery is through government owned entities. And the challenge that Sri Lanka has faced through this delivery model is that it's been funding focused delivery. So in each situation, the government looks for ways of finding the funding to basically deliver that infrastructure, but not necessarily looking at revenue models or the financial viability on the longer term. This is been the challenge in terms of this. But that said, we have been successful in delivering infrastructure. For example, in the power sector, we fare relatively well in access to electricity. We almost have universal access to electricity, and our loss levels in the power sector are quite low compared to other countries in the region or even globally. On the other hand, however, our cost of power delivery is very high, regionally as well as globally. So, and that is what's creating a challenge in terms of sustaining this delivery, and this is where we need to change. So, and in this context, actually, I should say, in the late 90s, Sri Lanka did quite well in terms of introducing private investment in a number of areas in the port sector, where we had South Asia Gateway Terminals, which is SAGT, which is the first private port project in Sri Lanka, and then also Asia Power as the first independent power producer, both of which are projects that IFC financed and supported in the development. But however, after this surge in the 90s, where both IFC and Sri Lanka were leading in the region, Sri Lanka kind of lost the plot or didn't basically build on this initial success that we had in the 90s. And since then, a lot of the other countries in the region have caught up and even gone further. Sri Lanka is still trying to catch up. In fact, in some ways, while we continue with a greater private sector engagement in the port sector, in the power sector, for example, most of the larger capacity additions have been reverted back to public sector additions. So the problem again is the incentives are not there to maintain efficiency and financial viability in the longer term. So this is where now IFC for the last number of years have been working with the authorities to try to bring in larger private sector investment in these spaces, similar to the examples I mentioned elsewhere in the region that I've been supporting. Then this is where I think we are very hopeful because of the ongoing power sector reform in the country, and there's good signs that we will be able to introduce internationally bankable power purchase agreements that can attract private investment, both domestic as well as international, to the country, and then we will hopefully be able to achieve longer term financially and otherwise sustainable delivery models in these spaces. So so hopefully IFC can continue to do more in this space going forward.
I'm sure IFC's investments have required careful analysis. So what are the steps that companies can take when evaluating potential ventures?
Good question. I think for companies, what I'll do is actually I'll go through the IFC process, and I think that is a good process in my view that I think companies can also adapt. So when we first get an opportunity to look at, we actually check whether the opportunity is a strategic fit with what we are looking to do. Are those in the core sectors that we want to engage in? Are they in the right regions? Do they achieve the developmental objectives at a high level? And then internally we have actually an initial early approval process where we don't do very detailed due diligence, detailed research on each of them, but we look at a high level across the many areas to assess if this is the right strategic fit, and then we present that to our management for approval, for what we call early review approval. And then once we have that approval from senior management, then we do a detailed what we call detailed appraisal or a detailed due diligence process, which covers the whole gamut of different areas. So understanding the market is actually very key. So for whatever the product or the service you're providing, is there a market for it? How big is the market? And then how does this product fit in that market? So we also do technical due diligence. So in IFC's case, we have technical specialists in-house, but when we do a project that also has other financiers also coming in, we may hire external experts as well when we need it to supplement that process. Then actually sometimes we may do a separate external market study in some cases where it's warranted or where there are question marks about there's a sufficient market for the activity or the business opportunity. And then we also look at other areas like legal and regulatory aspects, then environmental and social assessments, and looking at environmental impact assessments. Those are crucial from our perspective. We have in-house environmental and social specialists that help us review these. So we do an entire evaluation, and then finally we also do a financial analysis of the investment opportunity to make sure financially the financial viability stacks together, and we do what we call a sensitivity or a scenario analysis to see how does the opportunity fare in different conditions, because we may have a certain expectation on how the market will behave, but what if the market behaves in a way that it doesn't expect, and how can the opportunity survive? So we do these kind of scenario analysis as well, and once we've gotten comfortable, or if there are certain particular risks that we identify through this process, we come up with ways of mitigating and addressing them.
Financial planning plays a pivotal role in entrepreneurial success. What are some of the financial considerations that entrepreneurs should take when pursuing business opportunities?
So financial planning is a rather broad subject that we won't be able to fully cover in the context of this interview, but I can highlight perhaps some pitfalls and sensitive areas. So one of the things I would say key aspect in financial planning is cash, right? So you're doing your financial analysis on a cash basis. As they say in the industry, cash is king. And so you have to look at when you do your different accounts and so on, ultimately making sure your enterprise is viable on a cash basis, and doing it under different scenario analysis. We spoke about how when we do the analysis of companies, of doing different scenarios, different sensitivities. So doing your financial planning on a cash basis and making sure your enterprise is viable and sustainable under different stress scenarios would be helpful to make sure that your enterprise is going to be successful and can bear the different waves and tides as it goes through. And then also in the company's sort of lifetime, you will have different times where you would want to conserve your resources or invest more heavily. So those kind of things you decide when based on market situations. So you may have an initial plan, but you may need to change these depending on how the market conditions change. So if you talk about a situation like we had in COVID, when market demand had gone down, if you do have some excess cash, and that is a good time to basically do your major maintenance activities, invest in some rehabilitation work if that is necessary, and so to kind of make use of the lull to prepare for a potential growth in the future. But when there is a growth opportunity, there's a market is growing, or there's a larger demand, you want to come into those opportunities with full force of your resources, but with still an idea of how you're going to manage it if there is again a downturn. So You may have to decide carefully in terms of investing on your own resources versus things like renting and short-term leases and so on, depending on how long-term is the market growth that you see. So these are some aspects on how you decide on how much to invest longer term permanently versus using resources for short term.
I'm sure IFC has many opportunities when it comes to selecting what to invest on. So what are some of the strategies that you can recommend in terms of selecting these opportunities?
Yeah, so I think if you look at in terms of from entrepreneurs' perspective, entrepreneurs don't always have that opportunity of selecting from many because they usually have a product that they have developed, they have created, and they are trying to bring that to market. But there are some who are serial entrepreneurs who are coming up with new ideas. So maybe them or companies who are assessing different options will have to kind of go through this. And of course, as we discussed, you can do the detailed due diligence process. But I would say at a high level, I would probably flag two key areas. One is to look at the intrinsics and the fundamentals of the opportunity. I say that because you find often people and investors or companies go with speculative investments, which don't look at actual fundamentals of the business, looking at what kind of cash can the business generate and understanding what the market is. So that is going through what we call intrinsics or fundamentals of the business type analysis to understand, does this actually stack up? Because sometimes there is market hype, but when you do the analysis, we find sometimes the business doesn't make sense. The revenues that you get from the opportunity doesn't justify the amount of investment that is required. So we always go to fundamentals and intrinsics and make an analysis. The other key thing is actually the market. So the market, it can be two types, because you can have a market for a particular product that is in a saturated market, but if you are bringing a new product that is going to change the market entirely, essentially you are creating a new market. The other aspect is, what is the growth potential in the market? Is it a fast growing market? Is there domestic market, export market, etc. So if the market is growing fast, and then there is a very large opportunity for you to grow the product. So that is another, I would say, a very critical piece in this at a high level. Of course, you have to look at all the other aspects, but I would highlight these two areas as crucial in terms of assessing which opportunities to go after.
Risk management is something crucial when it comes to investments. So what are the strategies that companies can take in order to mitigate such potential risks?
So in terms of risk management, there are some risks that you can outlay, like through insurance and so on. So there, of course, you have to assess the cost of the insurance versus the risk and make those decisions. But beyond that, you as a company have to actively manage and mitigate your risk as they come along. But in terms of, if you had the choice of whether to take on a certain business opportunity with those risks, my advice would be to stick to your core competency, stick to what you know best to do, and so that's because you've already mastered on how to manage the risk around your core competency, your core business. And that's a problem that we see often with many companies, particularly in the subcontinent, where companies try to diversify into areas that they have no experience in. So, if you have an energy company, then trying to get into a hotel business, that's a completely different business. And then you're exposing yourself to areas that you haven't dealt with, and you don't have no comfort managing mitigated risk. Or some once some companies become big, they want to have a hotel, they want to also have a bank, and banking is a completely different industry and so on. Sometimes always grow organically. Sometimes if you, in the process of your business, if you develop enough real estate and so on, maybe it makes sense to go to leisure and hotel. But let the growth be organic rather than forcing it because you want to grow an empire, because that's when we see companies getting into exposures that they shouldn't have had, and losing well-earned capital that they've gained elsewhere. So stick to your core competencies would be one of the key things I'd like to flag in terms of managing risk best.
Emotional biases can impact investments. So what are some of the common biases that entrepreneurs face, and how can they overcome these?
Actually, emotional biases is a way of, it's part of life. Everybody has emotional biases. We all do at different levels. So I think the best thing to do is to be aware of one's own biases. If you are aware of your biases, then you're better able to manage and mitigate that in your investment decisions. One of the things I try to do is I try to listen to other parties and the feedback, and even if my first reaction is that is so wrong, I still go back and say, is there something I'm missing here? So always try to reassess and be open to different feedback, and not take things at face value, and reassess is key. So I think there's no way of avoiding emotional biases. It's about how you create greater awareness of it and then manage it better. From an experience perspective, particularly I would say in the regional context of the biases, I would say from my own observations, overconfidence and herd mentality are some of the more often seen emotional biases. You may have a situation where that particular space or product has done well and it's been growing, and people can get into the mind frame that things can grow forever, and therefore you keep investing more and more. That's something you see, and then also people follow the rest of the crowd or the competition and go beyond that. So again, dealing with these kind of issues, this is where again I would go back to the fundamentals and intrinsics rather than doing what others are doing, or even if you're forced by certain incentives that are offered in the market or otherwise, you always try to go back to fundamentals and assess the opportunity based on fundamentals to make sure it makes sense. The other observation I would bring in from a regional perspective is a intent on control and the name. So what I mean by this is, particularly where you have, in cases where you have entrepreneurs who've grown a business from scratch, they are very wedded to controlling that business forever, and also keeping their name in it. I think what is helpful for companies who've actually gone from an initial growth phase to achieving much larger, bigger business is when they realize that there is a phase that they can contribute well, and from beyond there, maybe a different set of expertise and core competencies can take it to a bigger level. Good examples, better known examples in the market is where parties like Bill Gates, he's no longer the CEO of his company. He's sold significant shareholding in his companies, and he's letting others run Microsoft, and he's now a shareholder only. So just realizing that when you bring in other parties with strategic interest, they can grow the pie. So even if you have a smaller share in a much bigger pie, your share may be bigger than having 100% in a smaller pie. So understanding that concept is very helpful for entrepreneurs and companies who want to grow and go beyond from their level to a much bigger level.
Thank you for sharing those valuable insights with us, Kamal.
It's my pleasure, Sachini. Thanks for having me over.
Stay tuned with us for another episode of Goodcents by Union Assurance.